1 Peter chapter 3, and we want to look at verse 15 of 1 Peter 3. Just give you a bit of a context behind 1 Peter. The immediate context here is Peter is writing this letter to Christians who are experiencing persecution. And our brother, Pastor Darrell, was just talking about that in his main session. And so Peter is writing to these persecuted Christians in the first century. And notice what he says in verse 15. He says, "But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet to do it with gentleness and respect." Notice the Apostle Peter here, first and foremost, says that we must honor Christ as Lord and to honor Christ the Lord as holy. Now, what Peter's actually doing here is he's actually quoting from the Old Testament. There's a passage in Isaiah 8:13 which says, "It is the Lord God whom you shall fear and regard as holy." Now, this is important because what Peter's doing here is he's placing Jesus Christ, he's placing his deity as a central focus of the apologetic response. That is the defense of the gospel. This is very important. Christ must be enthroned as Lord in our hearts. And then he gives these imperatives, these commands. He goes on to say that as believers, we should always be prepared or ready to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you. That word defense there in the ESV is the word apologia. This is the word where we get the word apologetics from. And what is apologetics? Well, a lot of Christians think that apologetics is the ministry of apologizing in Jesus' name. We apologize for the Crusades, the Salem witch trials. We apologize for the slave trade. I'm going to say a lot of that this afternoon when we talk about the influence of cultural Marxism and social justice in our society. But the word apologetics, the word apology, when we make an apology, we're saying we're sorry to somebody. But the word apology did not originally contain that meaning. The word apologia was a legal term. It was a term that was used in the courts. It was a term that was used by defense attorneys or defense representatives who would give a reason, an account, a defense for why their client was not guilty. And if you look at the word apologia, it comes from it's a Greek word that has really a preposition in the front, apo, and then the word logia. And logia is the Greek word for words. The singular is logos. But logia means words, and apo is the preposition that means away from or from. Apologia is literally away from words. It's giving a reason by using words and logic. The word logic comes from logia as well. And so apologetics is the defense, the giving of an account, a reason for why you believe what you believe. Now, the problem is that in Christian history, all the early apostles, the apostles of the Lord, the early Christians, all of them are apologists. And what that means is they were always ready to give answers for why they believed what they believed. They would answer the critics, for example. We see that in the book of Acts. When they preached and people questioned them, they gave answers. The church fathers would write apologies, like Justin Martyr wrote his first apology on behalf of the Christians. The church fathers were experts at giving reasons for why they believed what they believed. And then we move forward to the Reformers, and we see the Reformers doing exactly the same thing. Calvin writes the Institutes of the Christian Religion, and Luther produces his works as well, commentaries on various books of the Bible. John Calvin does the same as well in his commentaries. We see this with Philip Melanchthon. We see this with John Knox in Scotland and so forth, John Wycliffe in England, and William Tyndale. And all of these great men and women that God raised up were apologists. And I truly believe that this is the missing link in the church today. We're really good at professing. We're really good at proclaiming. We're really good at preaching. But we're not doing too good in the defense department. You see, in order to have a good team, I come from Toronto, so everyone thinks the Leafs are the best thing next to apple pie. I beg to differ. But when we talk about a hockey team or basketball team, Raptors, yeah, they won, finally. In order to have a good team, you need to have not just a good offense, you need to have a good defense. And so the issue here is this. If Christians don't know why they believe what they believe, then why do they believe it? So in my classes at seminary, I'll ask my students, why do you believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God? Well, I was raised in the church, and that's what we believed. So does that make it true? Well, Muslims are born into a Muslim family, and they believe Allah is God, and Muhammad is his prophet, and the Quran is the word of God. Does that make Islam true? You see, believing something doesn't make it true. You should believe something if it's true. And so Peter says you have to be ready to give a defense. See the word defense there? That's the Greek word apologia. Depending, you can look at other translations, it'll say to give a reason, give an answer. That also means, that's where we get, those words are also proper translations of apologia. But notice that Peter says that you are to be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you, which means we're going to get questions. We're going to be questioned by the secular media. We're going to be questioned by our Muslim friends. We're going to be questioned by our atheistic friends. We're going to be questioned by our Jewish friends. We're going to be questioned by our Buddhist friends. We're going to be questioned by everybody. And our response shouldn't be, hey, why don't you just come to my church? Or why don't you come and meet my pastor? Because if my job was to answer everybody's questions that they think you're the Bible answer man. Well, Walter Martin was the Bible answer man, and now it's Hank Hanegraaff, but I think he's more of the Orthodox church answer man now, because he's recently gone back he's actually moved into the Orthodox church. We can talk about that during Q&A if you want. I will leave some time for Q&A in our last 15 minutes. But the issue here is that we ought to be always ready, in a state of readiness to answer questions. And the church has been answering questions for about 2,000 years now. But when we fail in this area, this is what happens, folks. And I've seen this year after year after year. I've been doing this for 30 years now. Year after year after year. The most common complaints I get from parents is, my son, my daughter was raised in the church. They went off to college. They went off to university. And they don't come back to church. They've given up their faith. Statistics show that in North America, about 75 to 80% of kids who go to university, post-secondary education, don't come back to church. We've got a problem here. What we have here is, we have what? We have a problem with communication, a failure to communicate. We're not teaching our young people on the tools of defending their faith. And so what's happening is we're sending them out into the academic world, and they're going to be challenged by professors, and they're going to be challenged by their peers, and they're going to be challenged on the bedrock of their faith, and they're going to shatter their faith, and then they're going to walk away saying, well, I guess everything I was taught in church was just poppycock, as the British call it. It was just nice, fanciful stories written by these ancients who didn't know any better. Think of it this way. Do we send our military out into the battlefield with no military training? Do we teach our military combat skills? Do we teach them on the rules of engagement in war? Well, if all you do is teach military students, if you teach them basket weaving and music and English and send them off into the battlefield, what are the chances of survival? Not very good. So what are we doing? We're sending our young people with no spiritual training, no spiritual military training into the world, and then we wonder why we're losing our people. It's because we're not teaching them, we're not educating them, we're not using our Sunday school time to teach them the basics of their faith and how to respond to the critics of the faith. We're too busy talking about Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. That can only go so far. And quoting John 3:16 to a critic is not going to answer the question. And raising up 3:16 signs in football games is not going to answer the questions. And so Peter says you have to be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you. Not just some, but anyone who asks you. And we're to do this with gentleness and with respect. Do this in a God-fearing manner. Do this in a God-glorifying manner. So Peter says this is not an option. This is not a suggestion. This is a command. We are given the command to always be ready to give answers to our faith. Now, if you go to Jude, the second last book of the Bible, Jude, who incidentally is a brother of the Lord. If you look at Jude, the very first verse, he calls himself a servant of Jesus Christ, and he calls himself the brother of James. And in that letter, he is dealing with false teachers that have entered into the church. And they're bringing false doctrines into the church. They're bringing false teachings into the church. And Jude is calling on these Christians to take a stand for their faith and to be able to defend their faith against these false teachers in their midst. And so in verse 3, Jude says, "Beloved, although I was very eager to write to you about our common salvation, I found it necessary to write appealing to you to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints." So notice the imperative, to contend for the faith. That word contend means to fight, to put up an opposition to another opposing view, to contend for the faith. Notice he calls it the faith, and then he says, which was once for all delivered to the saints. So what has God done? He has deposited that faith into the care of his people. And we are called to defend it and to contend for it. And notice it says it was once for all delivered, which is, there's a completion to that revelation. That is to say, there are going to be people coming down the road who are going to say, we have the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. We are the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and Joseph Smith has the restoration of the gospel. Well, if you deny Jesus Christ is the God-man, you're not the Church of Jesus Christ, former-day saints, present-day saints, or latter-day saints. In other words, Jude is saying the gospel, the revelation of God has been given once for all. Beware of those who come and say, we have the restoration. We have the true church. We are now the true remnant. We are part of the true movement of God in our day. So, what do we do as Christians? Well, we have an obligation. Our Pastor Darrell was talking about how we have to take a stand and preach the word in season and out of season. But here's the point, folks. What do we do with all the social humanists out there who are questioning God's existence, who are questioning the existence of objective moral values in life and objective moral meaning? What do we do with the pro-choice movement that says that women's rights over their body should supersede any ethical argument from the Bible that all life is sacred and that we should defend life at all costs? Or those who would argue that as long as you love someone, that's really all that matters, whether you're male and male or female and female or male and female, or how about polyamorous relationships, which are not going on, where a man can have multiple partners, or you can have groups of men and women living together in a polyamorous relationship where you just switch partners. How do we respond to these questions? What about Muslims who are coming to the universities? They're here at the University of Windsor, the Muslim Student Association, which is the branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a terrorist organization, and one of their front groups is the MSA. They're coming here and they're challenging Christians on what they believe. And they're telling you that Jesus Christ never claimed to be God, that he was a prophet of the one God Allah, who predicted the coming of Muhammad. What do we do with those who, like the Dawkins of this world, who say that God is a delusion, that we've been duped? How about the social justice warriors, that religion is nothing but, it's part of the patriarchy? The religion has been instituted by patriarchal men who want to assume control over women and want to assume control over people's minds and to keep them in check and so forth. How do we respond to these questions? There's a lot of questions out there. And that's why I've committed my life to the field of apologetics, and I've been doing this for about 30 years or so. And my job is to equip the saints, to equip the people of God with tools with which you can defend your faith. But the problem is this: a lot of us feel a bit squeamish when it comes to apologetics because we always assume that, well, to be an apologist, you need to be a scholar, and to be an apologist, you need to be well-read. And no, that's not true. That's not necessarily true. Yes, there are scholars that God has raised up in the field of apologetics, but all of us are called to be apologists. All of us are called to give answers to those who ask of us. And so we need to understand that the Great Commission is not just the only commandment we have. Jesus Christ not just gave us the commandment to go and make disciples of all nations, but he also taught us that we need to be ready to give answers and to respond. Now look at the life of Jesus. Jesus knew how to effectively communicate with people. Did you ever notice what was his modus operandi, the method by which he did things? You notice that when you read the Gospels, when people came against him and they tried to trap him, did you ever notice Jesus would use questions? And remember, this is the master logician. This is God, the Word in the flesh. This is the Logos in the flesh, the very logic of God, the wisdom of God. And when he would interrogate people, he would ask questions. And remember, the question mark it looks like a hook. It's meant to grab people's attention. And he would ask questions, and when they couldn't answer his questions, he ended up explaining things to them and opening up their eyes. And sometimes all it takes is just one simple question. Can I have a drink? He asked the Samaritan woman, can I have a drink? And what did that end up with? It ended up with him telling her about himself. And the water that he can give is a water that will quench your thirst, that you would never be thirsty again. And that whole village of Samaritans came to know Jesus that day. Sometimes it's just a question in a Tim Hortons place, how you doing? How's your day been? And carrying a conversation. It happens on the grassroots level. And so what we need to understand is this, folks. We really need to know why we believe what we believe. This is why theology, my friend James White always says, theology matters. It's important that we know what we believe. Because if you believe whatever you believe because you were raised in this tradition, or you just believe it because it makes you feel good, is it really true? What makes truth truth? Jesus Christ came into the world and he said that you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And if the Son sets you free, you shall be free indeed. And then he made this incredible statement. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He claimed to be truth itself incarnate. And so the last time John uses the word truth, aletheia in Greek, the last time John uses the word truth is in John chapter 18, where Jesus is brought before Pilate. Pilate orders him to be scourged. The Roman scourge was not this whip that the Jews used. It was a reed. The Jews would use a reed as a form of flagellation, punishment. The Roman whip was a long leather strap. And on that strap, they would put pieces of metal, nails. And as they struck the victim who was tied to the whipping post, that leather strap would wrap around their body, and then they would pull on it. And that would rip the skin, it would rip the flesh, the capillaries, the blood vessels. And the Roman whip can continue indefinitely. There was no limit to how much they can inflict on the victim. Josephus, a first century historian, tells us that in some cases people died at the whipping post because they were so lacerated that their bowels would fall out because they would have ripped the abdominal muscles through the whip. And so Jesus receives this scourging, this terrible scourging, fulfilling the words of the prophet Isaiah that his appearance, his visage was so marred beyond human complexion that humans would turn their face from him. He was beaten to a pulp. And his face was so disfigured that the prophet said people would turn their faces from him. So here he is, bloodied. A crown of thorns is shoved into his scalp as they mock him as the king. And they put a purple robe on him to mock him as a king, and a scepter. And they bring him to Pilate, and there's this man walking to Pilate, and Pilate looks at him and says to him, "Are you a king?" And his response was, "For this purpose I came into the world, to bear witness to the truth, and everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And then Pilate asked this important question, this question that has been asked by philosophers down through the ages. He looks at him and he says, "What is truth?" And if you read the rest of the text, Jesus never answers that question. Why? There's irony there. Pilate was staring at the truth. It was right in front of him. The answer was right beneath his nose. And so today we ask, what is truth? Is truth objective? Is truth absolute? Or is truth subjective and relative? It's right for you, but it's wrong for me. It's wrong for me, but it's right for you. Abortion is wrong for you, but it's right for me. Same-sex marriage is wrong for you, but it's right for me. It's all relative. So when I speak at universities and debate with atheists and so forth, the question and answer period is one of my favorite periods. Because that's when all the students come out of the woodwork and they come up to the mics. And one of them said, "Dr. Costa, the problem with you is you believe that there are absolutes. And there are no absolutes in life." And I asked him, "Are you absolutely sure about that?" And you know what he said? Absolutely. They don't hear, they don't listen to what they're saying. You see, it doesn't matter what is true and what is not, because you see, the social justice warriors are telling us that truth is a social construct, that it's part of the patriarchy. It's their way to manipulate us. All of history has been written by the winners. And who wrote the American Constitution? A bunch of white guys. Who wrote the Magna Carta? The white guys. Who were most of the scientists? Newton and Kepler and Galileo. They're all white men. Science is a social construct created by white privileged scientists. That's what we're hearing today. Same goes with mathematics. What we're seeing is the collapse, the dissolution of logic itself in society, where words don't mean anything, where words themselves. George Orwell saw this coming. In his book, 1984, he predicted the advent of Big Brother government, watching everything you do, watching what you say. He spoke about newspeak, where they would come up with new words, that words would change their meaning, so that he and she no longer apply. You could be a Z, a zer, a zim, a they. So that biological binary distinctions are not absolute. So Jordan Peterson on Studio 2 was debating a professor from the University of Toronto. They're both from Toronto. And this professor said that biological sex is not a fact. That binaries like male and female are social constructs. And you need to understand something, folks. If language is collapsing, the means of communication is going to collapse. We're going to live in a linguistic jungle. And so what you're seeing now is this idea of newspeak. So those illegal immigrants coming over the border from Quebec, from America into Quebec, they're not illegal immigrants, they're irregular crossers. We're changing the vocabulary. We're changing the word. Just recently, they've been talking about this for a couple of years now, but the American Psychiatric Association is now talking about removing pedophilia as a mental disorder from their manual of mental disorders, just like they did with sodomy in the 1960s. They removed it from their category of psychological mental disorders when this type of behavior was accepted and legalized. Now they're saying pedophiles, those who are attracted to little children sexually, they're born that way. They're wired that way. Where have we heard this before? I'm born gay. I'm wired this way. So therefore it must be right. Well, pedophiles now, they're born that way and they're wired that way. Does that make that true? It's the same argument. And so now they're saying we shouldn't use the word pedophile. because that's pejorative. Now they've suggested we refer to these people as MAP, minor attracted persons. So what are they doing? They're changing the language. The federal government in Canada ruled that all legal documentation should remove references to father and mother. And they should only use neutral terms like parent. So when I conduct weddings and I have to fill in the marriage license for the couple that is getting married, they removed references to father and mother in all the provincial documents now in Ontario. Now they have parent. They're removing binary distinctions. And yet our binary distinctions, where do they all come from? The first time the word male and female is used in Scripture is in Genesis 1, 26 to 27. And it's connected to the image of God. And so in Genesis 1:26, the triune God says, let us make man or humans in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the fish and the creeping things. And then it says, and God made men or humans in his image, male and female, he created them. So notice how the image of God is integrated. The image of God is connected to our binary distinctions as male and female. And what we're seeing in our society is with the denial of God, with the denial of the imago Dei, that we are made in the image of God, we are denying our identity as male and female as well. It all logically comes together. Who defines us? Ourselves? Society? The UN? Our Charter of Freedom of Rights and Freedoms? What defines what it is to be human? God defines us as his image bearers, and he defines his image as male and female, he created them. And so in the creation account, what do we find? There's Adam and all these creatures, and God pairs them up with their opposites, and Adam had no one, and so the Lord said it's not good for man to be alone, and he says, I'm going to create a corresponding partner. The Hebrew word there means a helpmate or a corresponding partner. And so what does God do? The great physician, he puts Adam into anesthesia. He goes into a deep sleep. That's what we call anesthesia today. And God opens up the side. Now, traditionally, it said, in the King James Version, it says God took a rib. That's why when Adam came home from work, Eve always counted his ribs to make sure he was not cheating with some other woman that God created. Just kidding. The word actually, the Hebrew word means the side. And whenever that word side is used in the Hebrew Bible, it always refers to sacred furniture, like the side of the temple, the side of the Ark of the Covenant, Mount Zion, the side of Mount Zion where the temple of the Lord stood. It always refers to sacred furniture or a sacred piece. And so from the side of man or Adam, God takes something. People say it was a rib. We don't know for sure. And it says, and then he sealed up the place. That's surgery. He opens them up, fiddles around in there, and seals it up. That's what we call surgery. And what does he do? From that side, he creates this woman. And she is the most beautiful thing that Adam, and women, by the way, it's you guys have the honor of distinction here because it wasn't us men who are the crown of God's creation. It was you ladies. God saved the best for last. She was the crown of creation. And Adam wakes up, and Adam breaks out into a rap. He's the first rapper in the Bible, actually. He says, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. And then he did the moonwalk after that. It's a song. In Hebrew, it's structured as a poem. It's poetic. And so Adam literally sang, I would say, as he saw this beautiful creature that would become his wife. Interestingly enough, this Adam figure, remember Paul says he's a type of the one who is to come. Interestingly enough, this Adam figure points to the ultimate Adam. And we know that there were several Adams. There's no point talking about the last Adam unless there was a first Adam. But as you go through the story, you're going to notice something, and that is when God created Adam, he made him in his image, and he made him to have dominion. What does what does dominion mean? Well, what type of people have dominion and rulership? Well, monarchs. And so God creates Adam in his image to be a king and his wife to be a queen alongside of him, to rule, to have dominion, to subdue the earth, as monarchs do. And then he tells him that he's not only to rule, but he's his image bearer, so he's a king. But Adam is also a priest because he can approach God. He can approach God and commune with God. So Adam's a priest. But Adam's also a prophet because Adam heard from God and Eve heard from God, and they could talk to each other. They could relate what God said. And so here you have a man who is a king, a prophet, a priest. He's the image of God, and he's also the Son of God. How do we know that? Luke 3:38, the genealogy of Jesus goes right back to Adam, and it says, and Adam, who was the Son of God. So the first man is the image of God, king, prophet, priest, and he is the Son of God. Who else do we know is the image of the invisible God, the king, the prophet, the priest, the true Son of God according to his nature, the Lord Jesus Christ? And Noah was another Adam figure. Noah was also given the same mandate to rule the earth, subdue the earth. He was also a priest because he offered up sacrifice after the flood. He was a prophet. He preached to the people of his day. He was also a king because, again, he was given dominion, and he was also God's image bearer. And then he failed. There's another fall. He fails. He gets drunk in the vineyard, and he curses the son of Ham, Canaan. So there's another fall. The fall repeats itself. And then God calls Abraham, and Abraham is another Adam. He's the father of many nations, and God would make him a great leader, and God would make a nation from him, and out of him would come the Messiah. And the story continues until we finally get to that one who fulfills all the promises. And so, folks, you need to understand here that what we're seeing in our society is not just a dissolution of truth, it's the dissolution of human identity, it's the dissolution of language. And so I get other students say, well, you cannot know anything for certain. And I would say, are you certain about that? And they would say they're certain. If you can't know anything for certain, when you can't even be certain about what you just said, don't you see it? Or another guy said to me, there is no such thing as truth. Is that statement true? Well, by your standards, it can't be true. Well, then you've just rendered your statement absolutely meaningless. And so, folks, we are at a war here. We are engaged in a battle. And the battle is not physical. This is not a jihad with physical weapons and physical artillery. Paul says that our wars, our weapons of warfare are not carnal. They're not fleshly, but they're powerful in bringing down strongholds and bringing down every imagination that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And it says, bring it down to the obedience of Jesus Christ. In other words, ideas have consequences. I'll be talking about this more on Sunday. It was the ideas of an Austrian person sitting in a prison cell reading Friedrich Nietzsche that inspired him to come up with the idea of a super race, an Aryan race, what Nietzsche called the Übermensch, the Superman race. And this man became the Chancellor of Germany, and his name was Adolf Hitler. And he applied the ideas that he learned from Nietzsche, he applied it into a real life time. And what did he do? He brought about one of the horrific periods in history, known as the Holocaust. And many of his disciples are very much alive today, but not so many as the disciples of Marx. As we're going to learn in my session this afternoon, all of academia is plagued with the disciples of Marx. That's why they don't attack communism. They're attacking, they use the word Nazi to attack their enemies. You never hear them condemn Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and all the rest, because those professors are sympathetic to Marxist ideologies and philosophies. And so to be a good apologist, we have to understand why we believe. See, as a young Christian, I was raised in a Roman Catholic home, very religious. I had a cousin still alive who was a priest, a Roman Catholic priest. I had a great uncle who's now deceased. He was a Roman Catholic priest. We were a very religious family. Every Sunday we're at Mass. I prayed the rosary multiple times a day. I prayed to Mary, the mother of Jesus. I remember as a child going into the Roman Catholic Church, and I would stop at every place. There was a statue of St. Joseph. I'm going to pray St. Joseph. And then a statue of St. Agnes. I'm going to pray St. Agnes. St. Teresa. I'm going to pray to St. Anthony. And then I'm going to pray to St. Peter. And I'm going to, and that became so a religious act for me. But there's one thing that was missing. I didn't know Jesus personally. And I didn't know whether or not I was going to hell or to heaven or to purgatory. In Roman Catholicism, you have a third alternative. There's a purgatory. It's like a divine waiting room where you suffer your venial sins until they're all purged. And then eventually, only when God knows, you'll be admitted into heaven. And so being raised in that tradition, I came to realize that what if all of this is just make-believe? What if Jesus never existed? And maybe I'm just believing this because I just happened to be born into a Roman Catholic family. If you were born in a Hindu family, just like our brother was sharing on the video, if you were born in a Hindu family, you would most likely be a Hindu. You'd believe in Vishnu and Shiva and Krishna and Ganesh and the various gods, the 330 million gods in the Hindu pantheon. Does that mean Hinduism is true? And so what that did was it challenged me, and I thought, okay, what's the one thing that makes it or breaks it with Christianity? What's the one thing that if I could refute, the whole house of cards comes down? Well, it's not the Christmas story, whether Jesus was born of a virgin or not. That's not the make it or break it. And it wasn't his teachings, because everyone would say, well, his teachings were very good. You know, they're very ethical. The Sermon on the Mount is wonderful. Mahatma Gandhi, once the so-called civil rights leader of India, a lot of folks don't know a lot about Gandhi. Gandhi actually held to some very moral views. He was a racist, very racist against black people. In fact, when he was in South Africa, and the white Dutch South Africans would refer to him as a black person, he got very irate. He says, I'm not black. And blacks are lazy, and they're this, and he was a very, very racist man. No one talks about that. The Hollywood version has sanitized him. And the other thing you may not know about Mahatma Gandhi is to test his dedication to austerity, he would have young naked women sleep with him, so he could test his limits. No one talks about this today. It just doesn't fit the narrative, you see. And he also held to the caste system. The caste system basically says that everyone is born in various levels in society. It's like a ladder. And at the top you have the Brahmins, the priestly class, the lighter skinned. And then it works its way down. And right at the bottom you've got this group called the Shudras, the common workers. And then there's another group, the Dalits, the untouchables. They do the most menial jobs. They clean toilets and sewers and so forth. And yet in the West, no one talks about this. All they're talking about is Trump is a racist. No one's talking about this. There's an inconsistency here, and I'll talk later on why that's the case, why you never hear about these things. All you hear about is the patriarchy, the colonialists, and Trump's the Antichrist, and everything like that. But Gandhi believed that. He believed that there are people who are born in certain levels, and if you're born down here at the rung of the ladder, you can never move up. You can't marry outside your caste. So even if you have children and they're really bright and they can go to university, they ain't going to university because they're going to be cleaning toilets for the rest of their life. But no one talks about that. And Gandhi believed that. He said it was necessary for the functioning of a society to have that. And so what was it that would make it or break it with Christianity? You see, the one thing that distinguishes Christianity from all other religions is one thing. Muhammad is dead. The Buddha is dead. The Hindu sages are dead. Confucius is dead. Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism, is dead. Moses is dead. Abraham is dead. All of these great leaders are dead. But the tomb of Jesus is empty. Everyone else is worm food. But he is the risen one. Okay, wise guy. Yeah, you believe Jesus is risen from the dead. That's what you believe. Is it true? Believing something doesn't make it true. Is it true? Well, one of the reasons why I went into post-secondary education was I wanted to test this out. So I did my bachelor's and master's at the University of Toronto, which I can assure you is no friend of Christianity. And I was taught by predominantly liberal professors, and they tried everything they could to crack me, and they couldn't. One of them even said to me when I finished my master's, "I can't believe after all this time you're still Orthodox." I said, "That's because God put me in the critic's den, not the lion's den, the critic's den." And he sustained me. It got to the point where some of my professors were threatening to kick me out of their classes. Because I remember one year I was at University of Toronto in Mississauga campus, and the professor said, "I want you all to know that this is a university and that you are free to ask critical questions." I said, "Professor, can I ask questions on anything?" He goes, "Yes, be as critically minded as possible." And I'll tell you, that was one of the best years I had at university. Because every single time he would attack the Bible or Christianity, I'd raise up my hand and I would challenge him. I'd say, "I think you're getting that wrong, Professor." It got to the point that he said to me, "Shut up, Tony, or I'll kick you out of this class." What happened to be critically minded? Ask as many questions as you would like. And that was the only course that I got a C. My other professor said, "You should appeal that. You should fight that." I just didn't bother. But you see, folks, we need to understand something, that if Jesus did not rise from the dead, our faith is bunk. We're the greatest fools in the world because we believe this stuff. You might as well, don't tell Pastor Aaron this, you might as well fire Pastor Aaron, sell this building, pack up and go home if Jesus did not rise from the dead. See, every religion started off with, Muhammad is the prophet of God and he fought all these wars and he gave us this Quran, and then, the Hindu sages, they passed on their teachings to their other disciples, and the Buddha passed on his teachings. But you see, the Christian movement only got started after the resurrection. It didn't start with the birth of Jesus. It didn't start with his teachings. And it certainly didn't start with his death. When he died on the cross, the disciples thought, "This is it. We've been duped by this guy." Why do you think they were in hiding? They were scared of the authorities. They didn't expect him to rise from the dead. They didn't even understand what he meant by that. They thought he was going to rise at the end of the world, like every Jew believes. So I started looking into this, and I said, okay, I got to check this out. So what did I do? I started taking New Testament studies. I started taking biblical languages, and I started looking at the gospel accounts. And what I began to find is that the vast majority of scholars in the New Testament, believers and non-believers alike, over 75% of them believe that Jesus died on the cross, on a Roman cross, at about the year 33 AD. They believe that Jesus was buried by a friend, Joseph of Arimathea. Number 3, they believe the accounts of the empty tomb, that on the 3rd day following his execution, a number of his female disciples found his tomb empty. They grant that. Why? Well, because there's multiple attestation, multiple accounts. There's Matthew, there's Mark, there's Luke, there's John, and then Paul comes in, and then the book of Acts gives you another version by Luke, and they all are saying this tomb was empty. Well, if you find an empty tomb, your first conclusion isn't to say, if Uncle Harry passes away and they have his body in the morgue, and then the coroner says, "You know what, his body's not here." You don't conclude that Uncle Harry rose from the dead. You conclude that somebody stole the body, or they misplaced the body. And that's what the women thought. That's what the apostles thought. Because they know that when you die, you're dead. But something else happens. There's multiple accounts of Jesus appearing to not just individuals, but he appeared to groups of people, like the 11. One account says he appeared to 500 people at the same time. They saw him. And someone said to me, well, maybe it was a hallucination. I will grant a hallucination by an individual. 500 people hallucinating the same thing? You'd have to have a hypnotist up there to do that. But then you need to have a real hypnotist up there in the flesh. And then I realized that when you put those 4 things together, the death of Jesus, the burial, the post-mortem appearances that he appeared after his death, he didn't just appear to the believers. He appeared to skeptics. His brother James didn't believe in him. And it says he appeared to James. And James became a believer after that. And he appeared to enemies like Saul of Tarsus. And he joined the Christian camp. And what was his explanation? He says, Jesus appeared to me. I saw him. I heard his voice. And when you put all those things together, that's the origin of the Christian way. And so the Christian faith dies or lives on the resurrection. And that's what Paul says, if Christ be not risen, your faith is vain. Not only is your faith vain, we're still in our sins, and our loved ones who've passed away, they've perished. We have no hope after death. And so the Christian faith became not just a profession, but it was real. And so when we look at the resurrection of Jesus, skeptics have come and gone and said, oh, well, they misplaced the body. They put the body in another tomb, and they went to the wrong tomb. Well, it doesn't kind of work that way, because there was a lot of witnesses at his funeral. They saw where he was laid. Others would say, well, maybe the disciples came at night and they stole his body. Well, that doesn't work either, because why would the disciples, who were terrified as it was, concoct a plan and lie about the resurrection and then die as martyrs? Who dies for a lie? I don't know about you, but I wouldn't give my life for a lie. That you know to be manifestly a lie. People who die for worthy causes. Look at Remembrance Day. What did we remember? We remembered these young men and women, but mostly men, who died in the great wars, and we remember them because they died for what? For our freedoms. They died for a worthy cause, because they believed that the cause of defending our country and our freedoms was worth their lives. How do we explain all these early Christians becoming martyrs if they made this whole thing up? Nobody dies for that. Well, one of the weirdest theories I've ever heard was somebody say, well, Jesus had a twin brother. And he happened to be in Jerusalem that weekend when he died, and he told someone to take Jesus' body, buried it in a shallow grave, and then when his disciples saw his twin brother, they said, oh my goodness, Jesus is alive again. But he had no marks in his hands, nothing on his side. This is how desperate they come to trying to explain the resurrection, because they see, folks, they know that if he's the risen one, they know their doom is sealed. And so they've done everything in their power to try to destroy this belief. And so that's where we hang our faith. Why do we meet on Sundays? Ever wonder why we meet on Sundays? I mean, what day did God set aside for the Jews to worship on? Today. Today, the seventh day. Today is the Shabbat, the Sabbath day. But these early Jewish Christians, they kept the Sabbath, they kept the feast days, they kept kosher, and all of a sudden they start meeting on the first day of the week, which was like their work day. It was like our Monday, the day you go back to work. Why would they begin to hold their services, their communion services? Why would they come together and assemble and worship the Lord on a day that was never given any significance in the law of Moses? What caused that switch? The resurrection. It was on the first day of the week that they came to the tomb. It was on the first day of the week that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. It was on the first day of the week that the Lord appeared to Simon Peter. And then later Christians would call it the Lord's Day, the day of glory, the day of victory, the day of his resurrection. And so, folks, what this is going to involve is this. A lot of folks have come up to me and said, okay, give me the Joel Osteen version, 7 easy steps to become an apologist. Well, there are none. Joel Osteen is not an apologist. I don't think he's even a pastor. He's a guy who smiles a lot and stares at the ceiling a lot and smiles and says very elementary things that I can't believe he fills up a stadium, but that just goes to show there's a lot of itching ears out there. They want their ears to be scratched by these teachers who give them pleasant words and so forth. And so we have to understand that there's no easy process, folks. I'm going to lay it on the line. The Holy Spirit does not teach by osmosis. You don't just sit there and go, okay, Holy Spirit, no, I got everything now. I'm a Josh McDowell. I'm going to go take on the world. I'm going to take my elephant gun and go hunting. That's not how it works. What did Paul tell Timothy? Study to show yourself approved of God. A workman that does not have to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. It takes works, folks. You know what Thomas Edison was once asked? How do you do it? How do you come up with these ingenious inventions like the light bulb and the radio? How do you do it? You know what he said? 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. 99% is work. And it means you're going to have to take time. Look, folks, you take time to study for your exams. You take time to study your car manual and you buy a new car. You take time to study your income tax returns. We need to take time to know why we believe what we believe. There are answers out there. We've heard some great names in evangelical Christianity, haven't we? Some folks who just said, this isn't for me. Yeah, I wrote a book on, not being ashamed of dating or being ashamed of dating. And so, I think I'm done with this Christianity stuff. Another guy from Hillsongs, not surprising, but another guy from Hillsongs says, that's it, I'm done. I'm going to leave. I'm not a Christian anymore. You know why he said that? You know what he said? He said, because Christians can't answer the tough questions. That's what he said. And the problem is there are Christians who answer the tough questions. All you had to do was look. They're all over the place. You could find them just on a Google search. But to say that, Christians can't answer the tough questions in life, therefore Christianity is bereft of any meaning. And what we need to show, folks, is that we are a people who care enough about truth that we're going to tell people the truth. See, we live in an age of pluralism. All roads lead to God. God is known by many names. And let me show you how easy it is. If someone says to you, don't you know that all religions are true? How many of you have heard that? All religions are true. All it takes is just a simple question. So if they say all religions are true, just put it this way. Okay, Muslims say Jesus is not the Son of God. Christians say Jesus is the Son of God. Can these two statements be true one and at the same time? No. That's the law of non-contradiction. You violate the law of non-contradiction. A cannot be non-A at the same time and in the same way. So is Jesus the Son of God? He's either the Son of God or he's not. He can't be both. So one of them is wrong. They both could be wrong. Christianity and Islam could both be wrong, but they both can't be right. One is right, one is wrong. Bang. Laws of logic apply. You've just demonstrated that not all religions are true. Buddhism says there is no God. The divine is within. Judaism says there is a God. Can these two statements be true? God doesn't exist, God exists. Either God exists or he doesn't. There is no third alternative. Either he is or he isn't. Law of non-contradiction. What about those who say, well, all roads lead to God? Really? Like, we're going up this mountain, you're at Mount Everest, you start from the north end, you start from the south, the west, the east, and eventually we're going to make it to the summit. Maybe maybe winding on this side of the mountain, but eventually we're going to make it to the top. All roads lead to the top. But here's the problem. When you say all roads lead to God, what do you mean by God? I mean, the Buddhists don't believe there's a God. So how do they make it to God? Very different. What about God is known by many names? So it doesn't matter if you call him Allah, or if you call him Jehovah, or if you call him Krishna. They think God is in heaven, and he's doing musical chairs. So they say Allah, and he sits down. He gets up, Krishna, and he sits down. He responds to every name. Remember in the book of Kings, 1 Kings 19, you got the first UFC championship ever recorded in the Bible. Mount Carmel. Prophet Elijah versus 450 priests of Baal. It's pretty fair, 450 against one. Elijah says to the people of Israel, if Baal is God, follow him. But if Yahweh is God, follow him. You can't serve Baal and Yahweh at the same time. You can't serve two masters. You'll love one, hate the other. So we're going to have a test. We're going to have a contest. And you know the story. They said, okay, the God that answers by fire, that's the true God. And so they build an altar and they get the sacrifice. They slaughter the sacrifice. They put it on the altar. And so Elijah is very obliging. He says, okay, guys, you go ahead. You got first dibs. You go ahead. They start calling on Baal, Baal, Harris, Baal, Harris. And this is going on for hours. By midday, they start jumping up and down, cutting themselves. Baal, Harris, Harris. The thing about that cutting thing, remember that was in with some young folks who would cut themselves? No? Someone was just talking to me, I think it was Brother Glenn. We were talking about how the same-sex movement has taken the rainbow and how it's all about pride. It first started off as Pride Week, and then it became Pride Month. And now they wanted Pride poppies, where you can have poppies with rainbow colors. You see, folks, it's never enough. They're going to keep taking more. They're not going to stop until they've assimilated the whole culture. That's how sin works. Yeast spreads. You give them an inch, they're going to take a mile, and they're going to take more miles. Why the rainbow? Did somebody in the Bible make a covenant with somebody and said, this will be my sign of the covenant with you? After the flood, God said, I place my bow in the clouds. And this shall be a sign unto you that I will never destroy the earth with a flood, a universal flood. So that after rainfall, you see that beautiful rainbow in the sky. And it was a reminder to creation of God's faithful covenant to us that he would never destroy the earth and repeat the flood, as we see in the book of Genesis 6-9. And what has the LGBTQ community taken? They've taken this beautiful sign that God had given to humanity, that he would hold to his promises, and they've profaned it. It's now the symbol of diversity. Something that was meant to be a sign of God's covenant graciousness to us, they've profaned, almost as if they're throwing it in God's face. Remember, you said you wouldn't judge us, you wouldn't punish us with a flood again. And so they take that and they profane it. Back to Elijah. They're calling to Elijah, jumping up and down. And then Elijah's getting tired by this point. You know, it's like a couple of hours now. He's getting hungry. He wants to go to Reuben's and get a deli or something. He's getting really tired. And then he starts to say this. Now, this is in the Hebrew. You won't see it in the English. But in the Hebrew, he says, shout louder. He's still on the toilet. He's relieving himself. And then he says, shout louder. I think he's asleep. You got to rouse him. Wake him up. And he says, shout louder. He's on a voyage. He's migrated. Now, if Elijah was alive today, he would stand before the Ontario Human Rights Commission for using offensive language. But you see, God used mockery to show the foolishness of the worldview of the world. He takes the feeble things, and what does it say? It says the feeble things, the things that are weak, the weak things, the things that the world considers weak is the power of God. We look at the cross and the world says, what a disgusting display. A crucified person, naked, bleeding, suffering a slow, torturous death, the sign of agony, the sign of scandal. And God looks at the cross and God says, that's my power. That's the power. The preaching of the cross is the power of God. It is foolishness to those who are perishing, but it is the power of God to those who are being saved. And I look at the cross, and the cross says two things to me. It says, behold the man on the cross, where the justice and wrath of God is poured on him. But at the same time, the cross says, I love you. He takes the wrath, and God displays his love. He demonstrates his love towards us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, so that at the cross, justice and mercy kiss and come together. And God's justice is satisfied at the cross, and at the same time, his love for sinners is revealed. And what the world considers foolishness, the Bible says, God uses. He was pleased to use foolish things to show his wisdom, for the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of this world. And so God always does things not as we expect them. You know, Joshua goes into Jericho and everybody knows that if you're going to take a city, you just plan and you go in and you do it. What does God say? March around it for 7 days and blow trumpets while the people in Jericho are sitting on the walls having popcorn, laughing at these crazy Jews. God always does that which we never expect. He chooses a poor, unknown virgin in Nazareth, a young woman, probably the age of 15, a young Jewish girl in an insignificant backwater town called Nazareth, and he chooses this young girl to be the one who would bear the Son of God. And the Son of God comes into the world, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's not born in a palace. He doesn't come in royal raiment with a diadem on his head. No, he's born in a barn, and they place him in a feeding trough. You know what a manger is? A manger was not a cute little crib made of wood with hay on it. It was a feeding trough where they put grain and hay so that the cattle and the sheep could eat it. It looked like a concrete slab with a groove in it. The word manger, even the word manger, comes from the French word manger, which means to eat. Or in Italian, you know, mangia, hey, mangia, right? Hey, how you doing? Well, talk a lot in New York and Manhattan, and hey, you want a coffee with that? Hey, you want a Heineken? It's a deuce and a quarter. That's the way our Manhattan friends talk. But you need to understand it's. Even in the Christmas stories, we come to Christmas next month, we're reminded of that humility. We're reminded of that lowly birth, that this one who lies in a feeding trough is the one who threw the stars into orbit. This one who brought space, time, energy into existence, he is born in such a humble condition to show us that life is not about what you have, what you possess, what great reputation you have. Life is lived to the fullest when we become the servant of others. The king comes down and becomes a pauper. And the secret to greatness, he says, is not that you be first, but that you be the servant of all. And so what we need to understand is this, folks. There's a lot of good material out there. Let me recommend some of mine. If you go to YouTube, if you put my name on YouTube search and you put the third degree, there's a set of videos there where me and my pastor colleague, we cover a whole bunch of topics related to apologetics and various topics, transgenderism and so forth. And it's not called the third degree because we're not Masons. We had people in the comment section accusing me. They said Dr. Costa is an undercover Mason. Because when I talk, as you can see, I use my hands, and they said, look at his hand symbols. You know, he's clearly a Mason. And if he doesn't answer my objection, that means he is a Mason. Anyway, if you look at it, the third degree simply means like when it's used in law, you know, the police are going to give you the third degree when they're interrogating you. That's what it means. It has to do with questioning. We have a whole series on that. If you're interested in my outreach to Muslims, there's a website called answeringmuslims.com, which is one of the blogs that I write on. And if you're generally interested in debates, if you go to Google, put my name and put debates, you'll find debates with Roman Catholics, Muslims. A lot of them are posted on YouTube as well. There's no excuse for this, folks. There's a lot of good information online. I would recommend even my friend James White, aomin.org, aomin.org. You may want to check Josh McDowell's material, reasonablefaith.org by my good friend Dr. William Lane Craig, who we differ in many respects in terms of our soteriology, our doctrine of salvation, but he's a great apologist as well. And there's a lot of good material out there. R.C. Sproul, Introduction to Apologetics. J. Warner Wallace, Cold Case Christianity. Very good materials. He has materials for young people as well that are suited for children and young adults about how to defend their faith. And so we have no excuse, folks. With the internet age, we have no excuse. That information is readily available and it's out there. So I'm going to take some Q&A. So if there's any questions, please raise your hand. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Any questions? Yeah, that's what I thought. You know everything. Yes? Right. Yeah, don't you believe in science is one of the critics we have. And what they mean by that, what their intention there is to say, well, don't you believe in science? Don't you know evolution is true? That's what they're heading for, is to argue about origins, usually. So science, the word science comes from the Latin word knowledge. Scientia in Latin means knowledge. And science is based on what we can observe. It's based on experimentation, repeatable experimentation, and data that we can collect. So science is limited in the sense that science cannot explain everything. It's limited. It can only tell you what we can observe, what we can see, what we can test. So science cannot prove history. Why? Because history is past. It can't prove that something happened in the past. For example, 5 minutes ago, I was just talking to you, wasn't I? I was talking to you, right? That moment is now part of history. What I just said 10 seconds ago is now part of history. It can never be replicated, ever, in the same way and in the same way that I just did it. It can never be replicated. You never step into the same river twice. Things have changed. Science cannot prove that Alexander the Great conquered all of the east and the west of the Mediterranean. Because history is based on what? Reconstruction of the past. That's not science. Science can't prove whether something is ugly or beautiful. So if I say to a scientist, is this carnation beautiful or ugly compared to a rose? They'll say, that's a nonsensical question. I can tell you about the molecular composition of this thing. I can tell you about its weight. But the question of aesthetics, whether it's beautiful or ugly, that's not a scientific question. What about the question of morality? Can science tell us whether good and evil exist or whether it is wrong to do certain? They can't. Moral questions are not solved by science. Moral questions can only be answered by theology and philosophy. So science can't tell you, for example, whether person A committed murder against person B, but what science can tell you is that person A's DNA was found at the crime scene. They can tell you, yes, this DNA belongs to this person, but can science therefore convict that person? No, because that's the job of the judiciary, not the scientific community. In other words, science has its place. And so when people start saying, well, evolution is science, what they're saying is we can go back in time and we can reconstruct the past and we can tell you from this little tooth that we have, we can tell you what this thing looks like. Really, the best forensic scientist can't tell you what somebody looks like by looking at a chip of their tooth. You need more than that. And so science is good. And all the great scientists that paved the way for academia were all Christians. Galileo, Newton, Kepler, Mendelssohn. All of these people were scientists. And why did they believe in science? Well, C.S. Lewis said, men became scientists because they believed that there would be law in nature, and they believed there was law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So the reason why we can do science is because we know that there's a cause and effect relation, that when we look outside the four walls of this building, we know that if a car hits another car, that car is going to be damaged. There's a cause-effect relation. It's called the Law of Causality. And Einstein once said, what is the most indescribable thing about the universe? It's that it's describable. We could actually know when Halley's Comet is going to come around every 76 years. We can test things. That's why we can send spacecraft out into the atmosphere and so forth. And so what that means is, Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament, the sky shows his handiwork. In other words, the heavens are basically saying, you know, what's the motto of our Ontario license plate? Yours to discover. I hope Doug Ford doesn't change it to we're open for business. That sounds so tacky. Please, Doug. Come on, Dougie. I knew your brother Rob, but I think Rob was a better mayor. Anyway, would have been a better premier. But anyway, that's beside. I don't want to go there. But yours to discover. God is basically saying, look up into the heavens. Yours to discover. That's what the early Christians said. Why did they look at the heavens and explore and the telescopes and so forth? Because they knew that God had put the universe into order. He knew he crafted it. And that it declares, it shows his glory. And so when they bring up the problem of science, just say, well, science is great, but it has its limits. Science can't explain everything. But science is good. But science always fluctuates, doesn't it? Because new evidence comes forward and then they have to abandon. For example, they once thought that the sun was made primarily of iron. Until later studies showed, it was actually a lady who presented a PhD, I think in Cambridge University in England, and she argued that the sun was made of 90% helium. Well, the whole scientific staff laughed at her. Her doctoral committee laughed at her and told her, well, we'll allow you to present this as long as you recognize that this is not the acceptable view of science. Guess what became the acceptable view of science? Her view. We think of Copernicus, the Polish astronomer who said the earth is not the center of the universe. That was the view that was held before the 1500s. And it was called the Ptolemaic geocentric view of the world, which was held by all the scientists. Copernicus comes around and says, actually, it's the sun that's there and the earth and the planets go around it. And yeah, Ptolemy got it wrong. So what does science do? It adjusted it. It changed it. Right? Science is always changing. That's why you always got these new research data. A new research study has found. Because our knowledge is limited, and the more we know, the more we change, and the more we have to change our science as well. Yes, sir. How do we talk about questions related to slavery in the Bible? Very good question. How do we deal with questions about slavery in the Bible? Now, we need to understand something. When the Bible speaks about slavery, we got to stop thinking about the American slave trade. And we got to stop thinking about, well, it's like what they did with the African slaves and all that, or the movie Roots. If you remember, way back in the 80s, there was a movie by Haley called Roots, based on the book Roots, which historians have said he actually changed things around. He embellished a lot of that stuff in there. Slavery in the Bible basically was what we would call today contract workers. They were indentured servants. And what we need to understand is that in the ancient world, there were people who were obviously monarchs and part of the royal family, and there were people who were engineers that we would call today engineers. And there were these folks that really had no education or they just didn't have any skills. And so they offered themselves to serve, to be servants in the house, to serve the livestock, to take care of their farms. And so the word that was used was slaves. Now, what is important for us to realize is that when God gave his laws to Moses, there were already slave laws around the world, the ancient Near East. And when God gave his laws to Moses, and you compare them with the laws about slaves in the other countries, the Babylonian law code, called the Code of Hammurabi, said that if a slave runs from his master, he should be killed. And there were severe penalties. But if you look at the way God gave those laws to Moses, it's not that God is saying, I'm a slave driver, I believe in slaves and so forth. What God was doing was he was speaking into that culture and saying, look, this is the reality of life, just like divorce. It's a bad thing, but it's a necessary evil sometimes. You look into that, and God says, I want you to treat slaves with integrity, treat them respectfully. And there were also Hebrew slaves. There were Hebrew slaves that gave themselves to serve other Hebrews. So it wasn't just based on color. There are slaves of every stripe and color. But here's the thing. God told Moses, they can only serve for 6 years. And in the 7th year, the sabbatical year, they are to be released from their slavery. They are to go free. So notice slavery was this, it was God's way of saying, okay, we're going to allow this, but we'll give them this rule that it's only 6 years, and after that, you got to set them free. And if they have children, you have to provide for them. And even when they go, you got to give them a severance payment when they go. In the cases of slaves who wanted to stay with their owners or masters, then they were to go through a ritual where they had their earlobes pierced and so forth, and they would be indentured for life. But that was optional on the slave, not the master. And so as we go through the scriptures, what we see is that the Bible acknowledges this reality in the world, that it's there. By the time we get to the New Testament, the Apostle Paul lives in a Greco-Roman world, and the apostles where you see slaves as well, master slaves. But notice what Paul does. Paul says, masters, treat your slaves with respect, and remember, you yourselves are slaves to the master who is in heaven. So that at the end of the day, we're all slaves to the master in heaven. And in the Bible, the title, the servant of the Lord, the slave of the Lord, is a dignified title. The title of the Messiah in Isaiah, what is he called? The servant of Yahweh. The Eved Yahweh, the slave of Yahweh. Moses was the servant of the Lord, the slave of the Lord. Joshua, the servant of the Lord. David, he's the servant of the Lord. And so Jesus comes on the scene, and what does Paul say in Philippians 2? He says, he who was in the form of God did not think it robbery to be equal with God, but he emptied himself, and he took the form of a slave. Now, the New American Standard says bond servant, but a bond servant is a slave who's bonded to the master. The word there, a lot of translations say became a servant. The word is doulos in Greek. The word doulos means slave. He became a slave. He became a servant. And he became a servant and was obedient unto the point of death. And therefore God has highly exalted him. So in 1 Corinthians 7, when Paul talks about slavery, he actually says, if you can gain your freedom, do it. If you can gain your freedom, go for it. So already we see there's already the seeds of liberation going on in the early church. Now, if the early church were to stand up and say, Rome, you have to abolish slavery across the empire, the Romans would have massacred all the Christians in the empire, because that was equivalent to saying, we're going to take away the workforce out of the empire. Can you imagine if all the trades workers, the electricians, imagine a hospital. Let's say all the caretakers went on strike, the electricians went on strike, the plumbers were on strike. All of these folks go on strike. What would happen to the hospital? Would it be able to function without people coming and removing things and sanitizing the area for the next operation? If the lights went out, there was a blackout and the electricians were on strike, that hospital would collapse. And so when Paul said, look, in the meantime, let's serve one another as if we're serving Christ. Slaves, obey your masters as unto the Lord. Masters, remember, be kind to your slaves, just as you also have a master in heaven. And who was it that abolished the slave trade in the West? Well, in England, it was William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce presented a bill in Parliament and asked for the abolition of slavery. It was a Christian who took a stand on biblical principles. And John Wesley prayed for him and encouraged him. He never got to see the bill pass because he died. Wesley died. But Wesley said, I pray to God that this heinous abomination where one man enslaves another man, that this will come to an end and that the same will be done across in America. And it was fulfilled with Abraham Lincoln with the Act of Emancipation in the United States. So while Christians in the West rose up and abolished and called for the abolition of slavery, what many of you may not know is that slavery still continues today in the Islamic world. In fact, Muhammad owned slaves, black slaves, and in fact, Muslims today practice slavery in Libya and in Mauritania and in the Sudan, and the UN says squat. Did you know slavery is still going on today? Why don't we hear about this in the media? All we hear is about, well, the Americans and the slave trade and the British and the Dutch and the Portuguese and they were in the slave. Well, what about the Islamic, all cultures are equal. Who are you to talk against that culture, you greasy Islamophobe? Let's talk about the West. Let's talk about white European history. Let's talk about the white privilege of the West. Well, what about the white privilege of Muhammad? You're an Islamophobe. That's Islamophobic of you to say that. Christians are persona non grata. Persecution is coming. It's already here. It's on the horizon. And as Pastor Darrell properly and rightfully said, the reason why you're not seeing Christians being put into prison is because we're in the corner and we are doing that holy huddle. We are keepers of the aquarium. We're keeping the fish in the aquarium. We're not getting any more fish. We're going to keep them here. But the moment you stand up, like our Chinese brothers and sisters do, our brothers in the Middle East do, the moment you take a stand and you say, Jesus Christ is Lord and he is King, I will guarantee you, you will be arrested. I've already told my church and my classes, I may be preaching to you and teaching to you from a prison cell, if they let me use Skype in the prison cell or Zoom. Get ready. It's coming. And the reason why it's not in its fullest strength is because Christians are too busy being cowards, and I'm including myself here. Don't think I'm just preaching to you. I'm preaching to myself. And A.W. Tozer was right. Christians are known to lie well, especially when they sing. What do we sing? Stand up for Jesus. Onward, Christian soldiers. And what do we do when we leave the four walls? We suffer amnesia. We've forgotten everything we've said in this place. Jesus said, whoever is ashamed of me in this evil and adulterous generation, I will be ashamed of him when the Son of Man comes in the glory of his Father and his holy angels. Whoever is ashamed of me, I will be ashamed of you. Whoever confesses me before men, I will confess before my Father and his holy angels. Think about that for a minute. How can we be ashamed of him? He hung on a cross naked, ripped to pieces between heaven and earth, to the gaze of the onlookers walking by the side of the walls of Jerusalem. He hung there for me and for you. He wasn't ashamed of us. And yet, we're ashamed of him. Our King, our Lord, our Master, our slave, the friend who sticks closer than a brother. May God forgive us for our cowardice. We've betrayed our forebears. We've betrayed the reformers. We've betrayed the church father. We've betrayed the giants upon whose shoulders we stand. The blood of the saints, of the martyrs, is the seed of the church. And so, brothers and sisters, help us to just realize one thing. The Master calls us to deny ourselves and to take up that cross daily. You know what that means? The people who carried their crosses, they went to their deaths. They carried the cross to the place of execution. There is no resurrection without the cross. There is no resurrection without suffering. So, brothers and sisters, this is a word not just to you, but to me. Let's stand up in these evil days. Let us stand up and not be ashamed of him who is not ashamed of us, but for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross.